Black lives matter, right? I don't think black lives matter. It should matter. Well, let me say this: black life doesn't matter the same way because black people have been placed at a lower social status in America from the beginning. That didn't happen by accident. It was built. It was taught. It was preached. It was written in the law. It was written in the economics. It was written into science, religion, politics, courts, schools, and culture. And the reason it had to be built that way is simple. You can't justify slavery and degradation if you see people as see black people as fully human beings. You can't justify selling mothers away from children if you see them as fully human. You can't justify whipping people and raping people and breeding people and working people to death and still calling yourself civilized if you admit those people are equal human beings, and this is what you're doing to them. So before America could justify the oppression, it had to strip black people of our humanity. It had to create a story, and that story said black people were inferior, dangerous, uncivilized, cursed, hell, naturally suited for labor, and need to be controlled. And that's where this whole lower social status comes from. But we need to be clear about history. Anti-black racism is a full racial caste system. It's not ancient. It developed over time. Ancient people noticed color. Medieval Christians and Muslims sometimes attach negative meanings to blackness. Arab and Islamic societies developed anti-black stereotypes before the Atlantic slave system. But modern, hard, legal, scientific, economic, anti-black caste systems, right, that still affect America was mainly built between the 1400s and the 1800s. Then it expanded through law and science and religion. Before Islam and before the Atlantic slave trade, there was color prejudice. But it wasn't the same thing as the modern racial caste system. In ancient Mediterranean worlds, Greeks, Romans, they knew Africans and Egyptians and Nubians and Ethiopians and other dark-skinned people. They also enslaved people. But ancient slavery wasn't the same as modern racial slavery. Slaves could be Gauls, they could be Germans, they could be Greeks, Slavs, North Africans, and all sorts of people. Now, if you look at some of those people, the Gauls, they look like the modern day Swiss or Northern Italians. Basically, they look white. We call them white. The Greeks, they look like Mediterranean people. Dark hair, dark brown, olive skin. The Slavs, they look like Russians. You see, they look like Polish people. They look like people from Czechoslovakia, basically white people. The North Africans, they were lighter brown, olive-looking people. Some were mixed. Some were distinctly Negro in their features. But the point isn't that ancient societies had no prejudice. The point is that ancient slavery became organized. Ancient Greeks and Romans noticed skin color. You see? This anti-black caste system was made. It wasn't natural. But they had to develop it. You see? We could talk about religion. And when I look at religion, it's think about this. It's one of the biggest contradictions in the whole world. The Bible itself complicates this whole white Christian nationalist thing. The Bible world was not Scandinavia. It wasn't Northern Europe. It was Egypt. It was Canaan. It was Israel. It was Mesopotamia. It was Ethiopia. It was Kush. It was the Eastern Mediterranean. The Suez Canal is modern. But the land bridge between Northeast Africa and Southwest Asia was always a zone of migration and trade. It was mixed. When you look at the Bible, they talk about Kush. Those are lands in Egypt or below. These are black people. It's the present-day Sudan or Ethiopia. Moses' wife was a Cushite, a black woman. You see? So the later move was historically absurd. Europeans took a Middle Eastern and North East African religious world and whitened it and it culturally and turned it into their version of the Holy Bible, and then used that same religious tradition to justify putting African people at the bottom. And that's how powerful religion can be when people want to dominate other people. They can take a belief system that came out a world filled with Africans, Middle Eastern, and Mediterraneans, and then justify oppressing those same people with it. Shout out to Samson Killer. That's what happened. That's how religion was used. Same thing goes for Islam. They use Islam. Early Islam had universal ideas and anti-tribal elements, but Islamic Empire still developed the slave system. How'd that happen? Over time, African slaves were taken into North Africa and the Middle East and Persia and Arabia and the Indian Ocean world. And this wasn't identical to the Atlantic chattel slavery, but anti-black stereotypes did develop in these Islamic societies. By the medieval period, you had Arab and Muslim writers associated black Africans with civility and inferiority. I'm not saying that Islam as a whole invented anti-blackness. It doesn't mean every Muslim society treated black people the same way, but it does show that anti-black racial thinking existed in parts of Islamic intellectual worldviews before the modern slave trade because it was convenient. They needed it to justify slavery. Then you had the Europeans show up. They needed a reason to justify slavery. So they used religion. Even the Pope. He authorized the Portuguese king to subdue and enslave pagans and other non-Christians. At first, European enslavement was justified as Christian war against non-Christians, but once Africans became the labor source for the New World, the justification hardened around blackness. It went from they are heathens to they're naturally inferior. And that change was necessary because many Africans became Christian. And once baptism could no longer justify freedom, Europeans needed something deeper than religion. They needed race, and they utilized it. They needed it for the labor force. After 1492, when Columbus got lost on the ocean blue, Spain and Portugal built empires in America. They used indigenous populations, which were devastated by disease and war and forced labor. And so they needed another labor force for the sugar mining and the tobacco and the rice, and later the cotton. The Atlantic plantation system became a machine. That machine needed bodies. African labor became central because Europeans could buy, transport, inherit, insure, mortgage, and exploit African labor. So that's what they did. It was convenient. So they used theology to bless it. They created science to explain it. They created it, and it was normalized. This is how the racial caste system was normalized. And then they utilized laws. 1619, Africans arrived in Virginia, but the fully developed racial caste system didn't appear all at once. It was built step by step. John Punch case, 1640. John Punch was an African man in Virginia who ran away with 2 European servants. The European servants received some additional years as indentured servants. John Punch was sentenced to life in servitude. You are now officially a slave for life. That was the early signs of the law treating the African status different. See? In 1677, Virginia began to pass another law. At that, they said baptism could no longer be used to free and enslave people. So your religion isn't good enough. You're still going to be a slave. So Virginia protected slavery by saying even Christian black people could be slaves. In other words, they moved the line. And when religion could no longer do the work, race did the work. Again, they used the curse of Ham. This is what they did. Look, even though the biblical text doesn't say black people were cursed into slavery, they use Christianity to tell enslaved black people to obey while slaveholders ignore the moral contradiction of owning human beings. Think about that. At the same time this is going on, you have people like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Independence, language saying that all men are created free, except black people. Think about that. But they had to do it to justify slavery.